afternoon. My name is Behzad Naziri from National Council of Resistance of Iran. Welcome to our press conference today. I talk to you from Brussels. In 1 month's time, for the first time, a sitting diplomat of the mullahs regime and his accomplices will be prosecuted on charges of terrorism. The hearing of the case is set for 27th of November in Antwerpen city. Today we have in our Zoom conference 3 lawyers representing more than 20 civil parties in this case. They will explain about the investigation which lasted for 2 years and current status of the proceeding. First, there will be a message from Ms. Maryam Rajavi, the president-elect of NCRI. Then lawyers from civil parties will speak. Maître William Bourdon, a renowned international criminal and human rights lawyer. Maître Rick Van Rossel, a lawyer with expertise on criminal law. Maître Christophe Marchand, international criminal lawyer, and Mr. John Sano, professor at the Institute of World Politics and former intelligence officer. Then we shall have a Q&A for journalists to raise their questions. After Q&A, a number of distinguished political dignitaries from Europe and US and terrorism experts will speak. I invite you to be with us during the conference to get more familiar with this issue and the impact of this proceeding in the security of every European citizen. I thank you for your presence and ask my colleague, Mr. Fazlim Hashemi, to start the conference.
Thank you, Behzad, for your introduction, and once again, welcome to everybody to this conference, the distinguished lawyers and eminent personalities. Today, we have our conference about Iran regime's terrorism in Europe and the EU obligations. We hope that in this brief conference, we would cover 3 aspects of this case. Number 1 aspect is the judicial aspect, which 4 individuals, including a so-called sitting diplomat of the Iranian regime, are on trial for charges of terrorism with the intention to kill and also for participation in terrorist group. Assadollah Assadi, the diplomat of the Iranian regime, tried hard right from the beginning to invoke the Vienna Convention of 1961 in order to escape his persecutions, which simply what they have been asking was that the Vienna Convention should provide them with cover in order to get engaged in terrorist activities. Aspect number 2 is what we are facing is a state terrorism by the Iranian regime. As the investigation has concluded, this terrorist plot on 30th of June 2018 was decided in Tehran at the highest level of the Iranian regime, and 2 ministries, the Ministry of Intelligence headed by Mahmoud Alavi and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs headed by Javad Zarif, have been cooperating to carry this terrorist plot. So very clearly the Iranian regime at the highest level is engaged. Aspect number 3 is the political aspect, which is what the EU obligations are, because despite the fact that the EU has acknowledged the role of the Iranian regime, and in particular the Ministry of Intelligence, so far they have failed to take the appropriate action. So we hope that with the new revelations and with the new information coming up, then they would take a serious and more proper action and policy vis-a-vis the Iranian regime. With this brief introduction, I would like to first inform you that we have a video message from the President-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, Mrs. Maryam Rajavi.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be able to join this timely conference. Today, we are dealing with a unique case. For the first time, a so-called diplomat carrying a bomb with him is being prosecuted in Europe. As usual, the religious fascism ruling Iran tried hard to put the blame on the victims, meaning the Iranian resistance. When the regime terrorists assassinated Dr. Maryam Rajavi in Geneva, they first tried to put the blame on us, pretending this was a suspicious murder and a purge within the PMOI. On July 2nd, 2018, the foreign minister of the mullahs commented about the bombing plot at Villepinte that this was a false flag operation at the verge of the regime's president's trip to Austria, while a diplomat-terrorist of the regime carrying a bomb was arrested. On February 2019, at a conference in Munich, Zarif said, I quote, "It could be a false flag operation. It could have been an entrapment. It could have been a rogue operation." End of quote. The foreign minister of the mullahs had forgotten that. He denied the theory of arbitrary action in the religious tyranny in his remarks at the regime's parliament on November 5th, 2018. While defending the nuclear deal, Zarif told to his adversaries, "We are not an institution to act by ourselves. Is it possible to do something in this country without reporting?" In my 7 hours testimony during the investigation, I provided details of the decision-making and enabling process of this operation. I stressed again that the decision for this operation has been made by Khamenei, Rouhani, Zarif, Alavi, the intelligence minister of the regime, and subsequently implemented. This is not something new for us. The verdict of the court in Berlin in April 1997 about the assassinations in Mykonos restaurant condemned Khamenei as well as the then president, foreign minister, and minister of intelligence of the regime. Therefore, I leave a discussion of the legal aspects of the case to the distinguished and competent lawyers. But I want to make a few points here. 1, European countries must set aside all political considerations in this case. The regime's leaders must be prosecuted and they must face justice. This is a necessary and a preventive measure against terrorism under the name of Islam, which the clerical regime is its central banker and exporter. 2, Khamenei and Rouhani took a great risk by sending a diplomat to carry out the bombing and slaughter. The reason is that they are extremely vulnerable in the face of the people's uprisings, the spread of the resistance's influence, and the overthrow of their regime. 3, the clerical regime has become very emboldened over the past 40 years due to the policy of appeasement, to the extent that their diplomat, who has been arrested, makes threats of more terrorist operations even from inside prison. Today, the European Union is facing a serious and historic test in the face of terrorism under the banner of Islam. Therefore, what is the EU going to do with the epicenter of terrorism? The entire Ministry of Intelligence and the IRGC must be designated as terrorist entity. Agents of the Intelligence Ministry and the Quds Force must be prosecuted brought to justice and expelled. The regime's embassies and their so-called religious and cultural centers must be shut down. These are indispensable to guaranteeing the security of Europe and especially the security of Iranian refugees and dissidents, which will bring about the friendship and support of the Iranian people. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I would like to ask William Borden, one of the lawyers for the civil parties in this case, to start his remark. Mr. Borden, you have the floor.
I'm, of course, extremely honored to be the first lawyer to take the floor. I'm also extremely honored to recall that I have defended NCRI and his team, his movement, for about 20 years. It has been a long story of battle and friendly moments between my team and all the representatives of NCRI. Let's say without any excess of confidence and excessive pride that for the moment we won all the battle and we were in capacity to obtain regularly complete dismiss of charge in all the proceedings which were initiated in France, with obviously, which has been denounced by us, the main political underground, despite the continuous efforts of Iranian regime to put the pressure on French authorities, despite continuous efforts of Iranian regime to criminalize the Iranian opposition and especially the NCRI. We were able also with all our foreign lawyers, foreign colleagues, to obtain a definitive delete of the registration of CNRI in the terrorist list. So it's still a main pride for me to represent the civil parts in a couple of weeks in our city. I do not underestimate the historical, political, symbolical importance of this unprecedented trial. Unprecedented trial for two reasons. One, the exceptional bomb plan, which could have been devastating for numerous of persons in Villepinte, and unprecedented also because we know, thanks to the Belgian prosecutor, that the implication, the direct implication of Iranian state in this awful, disgusting crime is now established. So in a couple of weeks, we will be there with all our determination to defend the civil part with my friend. And we will be there also to assure that the judge will render decisions that reflects the seriousness of the crime and clearly establish, as it is the case, the direct implication of the Iranian authorities. For everyone in Europe and abroad, it will be clear that close to the four indicted will sit the Iranian regime itself. The Iranian regime will be at the main scrutiny of the judge, of the lawyers, of the prosecutor. And we're absolutely sure that, as it is clearly indispensable, that this diplomat has acted as a diplomat representing the state. So just an unnecessary confirmation to my friend of unnecessary NCRI. I will be there with all the determination and competence I'm able to mobilize, and I will mobilize them for you firmly and with determination. Thank you.
Thank you, William. You have rightly highlighted two special aspects of or characteristics of this heinous attack. Number one, as you said, was the severity of the casualties. Had this terrorist attack been not been foiled, and the second was the role of the Iranian regime. So now I will ask another lawyer of the civil parties in this case, Rick Van Russell, who has been engaged in this case right from the first day. Rick, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Hashimi, for introducing me. I didn't really catch what you were saying because I believe to the audience you were still muted, but I did understand that you asked me to take the floor, which is of course in consequence to what Mr. Bourdon already said, a great honor to defend the privileges of the Iranian democratic opposition. We are entering the final phase of the correctional procedure before the Antwerp Correctional Court. As already mentioned, on the 27th of November, the case will be heard by the court, and probably also on the 3rd of December, the case will go on for probably 2 days. The investigation has taken a long time, more than 2 years, and an exceptional long protective custody for the 4 defendants who have in the beginning always insisted of being released. I believe their hopes at that have gone out the window. Together, I also believe with their hopes to remain out of prison after the trial. We have introduced our first written memoranda. We already received the arguments of the defense, which are of course known to everybody who is involved in the case. And that is the absolute, and to me personally, a bit surprising hiding as a secret agent behind the Vienna Convention. Of course, you cannot call upon immunity for being a diplomat when you are in disguise, when you are a secret agent, when you are trying to bomb 25,000 innocent people inside the Villepinte Exposition Hall. And actually, this is a symbolic attack on the values of our Western civilization, on the values of democratic free speech, on the values of democratic free opposition. We believe, and it is our established opinion, I believe together with the prosecution, that the 4 defendants will be held accountable for their actions. And as Mr. Bourdon, William, already said correctly, the 5th party, or maybe the first party on the defendant's bench, will be indeed the Iranian regime. This is a case of criminally sponsored state terrorism. I believe Mr. Sano and Mr. Monica will also have a few words to say about this topic. We expect the verdict to be pronounced at the end of October, the end of November, the beginning of December. And of course, then we will analyze what this result will be. Needless to say, this is a symbolic case, a case that symbols the determination to protect the European and Western values against an authoritarian clerical regime. We are not only defending the NCRI, but every Iranian opposition present in Villepinte, and also our citoyens de l'Europe, our co-civilians in Europe. Of course, we are not here to allow diplomats or secret agents under the cover of diplomacy to act in a terrorist way. We are proud to be representing the civil parties, amongst them the NCRI, but also 18 dignitaries who were present and whose lives were actually critically in danger at that time. Finally, I think it is also our duty, myself as a Belgian criminal defense lawyer, to thank the Belgian authorities who have cooperated with the European national security services and other European countries, and who have established a firm case against the 4 defendants and against the Iranian regime. It is through the Western and European cooperation that we were able to foil this attack. And I believe the Belgian authorities played a vital role together with the German, the English, and the French, of course. So thank you for giving me the floor, and I will pass the word back to Mr. Hashimi.
Thank you, Mr. Van Roostal. You correctly again highlighted the fact that the Vienna 1961 Convention is not to justify or invoking it for use of terrorism by the Iranian regime, and this clearly shows that the Iranian regime and the defendants really on factual aspects of the case have nothing to really offer. And you also mentioned about your role as both protecting the Iranian people or the Iranian opposition, but also the European values and European citizens against the terrorism of the Iranian regime in their soil. Thank you very much for your intervention. And now I will ask another lawyer of the civil parties, Mr. Christophe Marchand. Please, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I'm very happy to represent NCRI and the other civil parties in this case with my colleagues and friends, Rick Van Roostal and William Bourdon. I must say I'm quite new in the case, and my first eye was on the importance of this case. I think it's the most important case of the 21st century related to, or one of the most important related to terrorism that we are now facing in Europe. Why that? Because it's really an attack on democracy. It's an attack on human rights. And in the first writings we presented to the court, we recalled a lot of reports from Amnesty International, even the last report of September 2020, reports from the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the protection of the freedom of the persons in Iran. Those reports are very clear about the fact that the victim, the persons who are attacked, in this case, NCRI, have been the subject of systematic attacks from these authoritarian regimes for decades. And it failed because NCRI was protected in the European Union. And because it was protected, the Iranian regime had no other opportunity as a last resort to use terrorism, to use an attack trying to harm this democratic movement. Now, the second thing I want to say is we received the legal written arguments from the defense, which are on one side, you can think very ambiguous, because they are claiming they have, or one is claiming having diplomatic immunity. He claims immunity, but this is a very paradoxical situation, because if he claims diplomatic immunity, it means he claims Iranian responsibility. And that is really a key issue. We now have in writings the position of the authoritarian Iranian regime claiming responsibility for this horrible act. But this will not hamper us to go for justice, as we always do as lawyers. And this is what we're going to try to have. And we have a lot of confidence in what will happen in court, because we have a solid judicial system. And this solid judicial system will not accept that this authoritarian regime attacks and try to kill innocent people in a very furious and horrible and terrorist way. So now we are preparing our responses to those legal arguments. And of course, the basic is that immunity is not impunity. And the Iranian people who organized this horrible attack are going to be punished. Thank you for your attention. And of course, this is the demonstration that, to the contrary to what the Iranian regime said before, that it would be a false flag or a rogue operation, now they are claiming that this was an act by the Iranian regime. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Marchand. You rightly said that this is one of the most important cases in the 21st century. In fact, it is a unique case which a state is using its diplomatic privileges and facilities in order to engage in acts of terrorism with the intention of killing hundreds or maybe more innocent individuals, whether Iranian or from other citizens. And you also correctly said that the Iranian regime is really looking for impunity from their crimes, not immunity, because no immunity can be given to those who are engaging in terrorism against Iranian people. At this stage, I would like to ask Mr. John Sano from the United States. Mr. Sano is an expert on this issue. He has been for over 30 years in the intelligence community, and currently he's teaching at the Institute of the World Politics. Mr. Sano, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm not sure about my audio system. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can all hear you. Please go ahead.
Good. Thank you. So good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today about what, by any measure, is a serious breach of international law, not to mention a rather heinous act of cowardice and terrorism. I'm speaking about the case that we've all been discussing against Assadollah Assadi, a senior Ministry of Intelligence and Security official who likely was operating on the direct orders of the supreme leader. The case against him is undeniable. As the French government officially stated, without any doubt, the responsibility for this plot falls on the Iranian Intelligence Ministry, the Ministry of Intelligence and Security. As the senior most intelligence officer for Iran in Europe, and someone who previously spent a considerable amount of time in Iraq targeting the MEK, targeting US military forces in the region, he was the person who personally handed the explosives to be used in this attack to Nassima Nami and Amir Sadouni. While Assadi and other MOS operatives have been indicted, the European Union has put part of the MOIS and two of its senior officials on its sanctions list. Quite frankly, this is not enough. There should be international outrage and a more comprehensive plan to mitigate and eradicate the MOIS, which the US government has officially designated a foreign terrorist organization. So in addition to what will inevitably be a guilty verdict, Assadi has had the audacity to threaten authorities with retaliation should, or I should say, when a guilty verdict is returned. That's clearly unacceptable and indicative of just how brutal the MOIS can be. So let me speak very briefly about the MOIS. They operate worldwide. Excuse me. They use a variety of methods and tactics. They operate undercover as a diplomat, either through official embassy channels or through business organizations. They work very closely with the IRGC and other security agencies. But to label them an intelligence agency in the purest sense of the word would be a misnomer. From ancient times, nations relied on intelligence as an essential element of statecraft. And intelligence was a reflection of the culture and the value system of a given society. But in the modern era, there are changes that have occurred so that the nature of intelligence moved from survival of the regime to one protecting human rights and freedoms. The MOIS never made that transition. They see their only reason for existence as being the protection of the regime and the eradication of its enemies. So a legitimate intelligence service should therefore reflect the principles, the aspirations, and the ideals of its people, not oppress them. So in terms of how the MOS operates, basically they, as I mentioned earlier, a terrorist organization. They are the central organization in Iran that deals with intelligence operations. So they are beholding to no one other than the supreme leader. So In 1996, by way of background, the Iranian government created an organization called the Supreme Council for Intelligence Affairs. They put this entity under the MOIS. That entity alone has over 25,000 people in their organization. Even the IRGC falls under the mandate to a significant degree. Its external operational wing, the Quds Force, are required to report to the MOIS. So talking about this trial and how, as you mentioned previously, this disinformation, that's the largest component in the MOIS, the Department of Disinformation. They use psychological warfare. They employ, thousands of officers, including former members of the MEK and other opposition groups. So they infiltrate foreign-based operation groups. They basically are attempting, with very little, if any, success, to manipulate these organizations into either, acquiring information on what they're doing, or, and again, has never been proven successful, try and manipulate that organization into being, at a minimum, less hostile to the regime, or perhaps being more supportive. So during my career in intelligence, working for the agency, I've encountered a number of MOIS operatives. And while their tactics may be somewhat outdated compared to other intel organizations, the breadth of their coverage, the capabilities at their disposal, and the unrestricted authorities they have are unmatched. They have been able to intimidate, coerce, kidnap, and even kill opponents of the ruling mullahs, to whom they view as their sole protector. So one of the largest components is, as I said, disinformation. They're the ones that have spread the false rumors about not just the Iranian regime's objectives, but about opposition groups as well. They manipulate very successfully the media, both in terms of providing a more positive image of Iran and planting false stories in the press about opposition groups like the MEK. So they blamed the terrorist attacks, such as the IRGC Quds Force plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the United States several years ago, and other falsehoods. So even in this most recent incident about Assadi, the attempted assassination, the MOS tried to shift blame for this act on the MEK itself, saying that this was a false flag operation. False flag meaning they're pretending to be someone other than who they really are. So these and other untrue allegations have been made loudly and persistently by Tehran's functionaries, both witting and unwitting, in America as well as Europe. The MOIS is a sophisticated service and quite subtle when trying to influence the media and policymakers into adopting their lies. These lies are spreading not just in various blogs and social media, but been picked up by the mainstream media, from CNN to the New York Times. They are designed to present a different face of Iran, to depict those that stand up for democracy, for basic human rights, freedom of expression, freedom of association, to be free from arbitrary arrest and detention, as well as torture, and depicting them as subversives, as terrorists. And the chain of command, let me conclude with this. The MOIS literally is above the law. They are accountable only to the supreme leader. And while the supreme leader would normally go through the aforementioned Supreme National Security Council, he can, and I believe in this case was actually the example that we're using, he often goes directly to the MOIS. So there's no supervision, there's no transparency whatsoever. And given the fear that the Iranian regime has about the MEK and about pro-democracy movements in the country, in the world rather, it gives the regime, great concern. They are concerned about survival. And if you look at the uprisings that have occurred in Iran over the past few years, looking to, not overthrow necessarily, but to change the regime into a more democratic one, they are extremely frightened, extremely frightened. And they see the MEK as the largest entity that represents the will of the Iranian people themselves for a free and democratic Iran. So they are desperate. They continue to see the MEK as a major threat to their survival. So it's imperative that Assadi, his cohorts, and indeed the MOIS and the mullahs in Tehran be held strictly accountable for this incident and for the continuous atrocities that Tehran continues to perpetrate against their enemies and to the people of Iran. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sano, for your remarks. Very correct, and thank you for the detailed explanation about MOIS as a terrorist entity and also the fact that resorting to such terrorist attacks in Europe is really out of fear and desperation of the Iranian regime facing the growing resistance within Iran. Now, I would like to give a few minutes to the journalists who are present in this conference to raise any question that they wish, and then we will continue with the remarks from other dignitaries that we have with us today in the conference. Let me see if there is any journalist. Mr. Joseph Hammond, he has written a question. He is asking, is there going to be prosecution from other European countries? So any of the lawyers would like to respond to this question, whether there is any intention in other European countries to prosecute either these or other would-be terrorists of the Iranian regime.
Yeah, just to say that still pending in France a criminal police investigation, which is just to be exhaustive, a proceeding which has been opened in respect of the wish of France to collaborate with Belgian authorities, but the truth is that we cannot expect from the results of this criminal police investigation any kind of prosecution or trial in France.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is, and I read it, when do you think EU countries will change its policy or their policy and distance from the regime? This is a question that I don't know whether any of the lawyers or one of the dignitaries who are present would like to answer. Maybe Ambassador Terzi, if he wishes to respond to this question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Hashimi.
You're welcome.
I'm making my remarks later on. I just answering this question. I believe that this trial, this indictment, it is very important. Is an important step towards making a government like the Italian government, which is a government which has followed the line of appeasement vis-a-vis Iran over the last years, but since a long time ago, and has been a supporter of JCPOA program for nuclear deal. But this trial is an element which is not an exaggeration to call it an historical step, as it was defined by the lawyers who have intervened just a few minutes ago. It's historical because from the effect that is having, for the first time, is breaking, at least is starting to break the complete silence, and they'll say also media complicity vis-a-vis Iran. We have seen a few days an important story in Corriere della Sera, which is the main Italian newspaper, which comes to a full page of explanation of what was the real threat in Villepinte. This is an example, but other media, of course, have developed on this story. It is quite an unusual situation, this attention to the media for such a negative element about the Iranian theocracy. There's been a completely different narrative up to now. And this trial is extremely important. I just wonder, concerning possibility that other court action in other European countries, whether that could happen on the basis of public initiatives, like making aware Italian prosecutors that this case is connected to a network of pernicious Iranian presence in our country. For instance, Hezbollah, there have been reports that Hezbollah is having some explosive depot also in Italy, and possibly they own some launching pads also from my country for foreign operations. So this is just an allegation, has not been proven up to now, But on this basis, I think that a follow-up to the trial in Brussels could be very much imaginable also in other European countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. The next question is from Adam Shaw of Fox News. He has asked, have you heard from other countries on this matter? Is there interest from EU countries or they are ignoring it? Can anybody would like to answer this question? The question is whether there is interest in other European countries. Rick, please go ahead. Mr. Van Russell.
I believe the case has been kept relatively quiet in European means. To my knowledge, this has a few reasons. First of all, the diplomatic sensitivity of the case. Secondly, the terrible Iranian foreign policy agenda, which is, as we all know, kidnapping a lot of European Western dignitaries, scientists. One of them was a scientist in the Brussels Free University. Another one is a Briton and an Australian scientist. So I believe behind the scenes, there is a whole diplomatic carousel awaiting the outcome of the trial. And then, of course, the four defendants should, and if and when they are convicted, will become on the playing field of the international extradition of prisoners or secret agents. So that, to me, is one of the reasons the case has been followed very narrowly by all Western governments and Western authorities. But the international rumors and the international media have been relatively quiet about this. Of course, we are in the midst of one of the largest health crises the world has ever seen. So this has also overshadowed the attention to this historic case. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Russell. Yes, in fact, over the past 40 years, due to the policy of appeasement, unfortunately, the Iranian regime has become more emboldened to pursue its objectives through terrorism and blackmailing. So we hope that this time, given the fact that what they intended to do would have resulted to the death and injuries of hundreds or probably thousands, being the largest or more severe terrorist attacks in Europe, it is hoped that the European countries, the EU, will adopt a different policy because the policy of appeasement has proved to be a failure. So if I may go to the next question from Mr. Bruno de Morgan, he has asked, you said Europeans should take more serious and more proper action towards the Iranian regime. What kind of actions? And he has asked also a second question, that you said Europeans should take more serious and more proper action towards the Iranian regime. What kind of action? So it seems that this question is more directed to me because I made those remarks. I think the answer was already given in the message from Mrs. Rajavi, who very clearly outlined what the European Union, what the European countries should do in this regard. They have to adopt a firm policy vis-a-vis the regime. They have to really expel all agents of the Iranian regime, and in particular, given the role of Assadi as a so-called diplomat in this terrorist plot, it is time for the European countries to shut down the embassies of the Iranian regime, which have been operating as center of terrorism for many, many years. So there are very practical steps before the European Union and each member states of the European Union. So if I move to the next questions, the question is what kind of retaliation from the Iranian regime one would expect, like executing Iranian scientists who have connection to Europe or are currently on death row. What retaliation do you expect from the Iranian regime should they be convicted? any of the panelists would like to respond? Senator Torricelli, do you want to respond to this question?
Given the nature of the regime, as they have already forecast, probably the most likely response to a conviction is a terrorist act. It's hard to believe we're even having that conversation, but that would be the nature of the regime and the history of their actions. And while I know that will scare many appropriately, to even take that retaliation into consideration going to a trial would compromise our own system of justice. So recognizing the reality that that may be what they are likely to do, we nevertheless have to go forward. We owe it to ourselves, to history, to our own people, to proceed regardless of those risks, or we risk our own governments being intimidated. I'd like to return too, if I could, Farzan, to the previous question. I recognize the reality that for political and economic reasons, many governments in Europe, unlike my own, will be loath to break diplomatic relations or close embassies. But that doesn't mean that they're without options. If diplomatic cover is going to be used for criminal activities, in this case, state-sponsored terrorism, each country in Europe has an obligation to itself and other members of the EU to be ensured that Iranian consulates and embassies are being properly monitored. So while they may not do as I would do and close those embassies, they certainly can close consulates, reduce the size of staffs, ensure that representatives of the regime are so limited that they can be properly monitored to ensure that if they're engaged in these activities, it is being known and they are being watched. So even if there's a political decision to maintain relations, the governments of Europe are not without options in both sending messages by reducing these staffs and consulates, but even more so practically ensuring that they can be properly watched. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Marchand, would you like to add anything if you wish to intervene? Mr. Christophe Marchand, if you would like to say a few words on this question.
Okay, just I wanted to share with you sort of situation in the sense that I think we can really see this attack that was planned in Villepinte as an act of aggression, which is really from the Iranian state towards the European Union. You know, which means that it brings Iran infringing international law, really the core basics of international law, which is to have peaceful relation. They don't want peaceful relation. They are just infringing these peaceful principles by preparing this act of aggression against France and the whole European Union. So this means that the European Union just has to realize what is at stake in this case, and that after the judge will establish all the facts independently in a fair trial, the political organization, the political institutions of the Union will have to take their own responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marchand. And Ambassador Joseph, did you want to intervene on this question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
I'd just like to add a footnote to the Senator's answer to the first question. That is, what can we expect of the regime in response to a guilty finding? I certainly agree that we can expect another terrorist attack, but we can also expect another terrorist attack if we have a different outcome to the trial. The fact of the matter is we have a 40-year record of the regime conducting terrorist attacks. This is a long-term process. And I think what we need to do is to establish the principle that the cost of these attacks, the cost of these actions must outweigh the gain that the regime gains from it. And I think that's going to be key. And it's going to take a good deal of time to reverse that pattern and to make very clear to the regime that the benefits for conducting these terrorist attacks in Europe and elsewhere are outweighed by the costs. And that requires the European governments, other members of the international community to stand up to these terrorist attacks and to find the responsible parties guilty. And that includes, in the case of this terrorist diplomat, two words that aren't often used together, the leadership, as someone said, at the very highest levels of the Iranian government. Thank you.
Thank you, ambassadors. I fully agree with the comments by you, Mr. Makhshan, and Senator Torricelli. As far as the nature of the mullahs regime is concerned, yes, they would like to resort to more terrorism, as already the diplomat-terrorists in jail have threatened to take retaliation if they are convicted. But at the same time, based on experience, they make these claims, they make this claim of retaliation to really test their counterpart. If there is a tough and if there is a firm policy versus the regime, they will back down. So very much depends on what policy the European Union, the European countries will adopt. Being firm, the regime will back down. But if they feel that they can get away with their terrorism and with this threat, then they will become more emboldened. At this stage, we will stop the Q&A for time being, and at the end of the conference, we will have more opportunity for Q&A. Now, I would like to invite Ambassador Terzi, the former Foreign Minister of Italy, to make his remark. Mr. Ambassador, you have the floor.
I go back to the audio. Yes, it is there.
Yes, it's fine. Please go ahead.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I would like to start expressing my deepest respect and admiration to the President-elect of NCRI, Madame Maryam Rajavi, and to yourself, Mr. Hashimi. I believe that it is quite clear. It is clear, as we have already mentioned up to now, that next Friday, 27 November, is the starting date for the trial of the Iranian diplomat indicted of terrorism of Assadollah Assadi, and that this date, this incoming date in the next few days, represents finally a very welcome chance to hold the Iranian regime accountable for its misdeeds. We didn't need the attempted terrorist attack in Villepinte to prove that the Iranian theocratic state is the #1 terrorist state in the world, as we didn't need another massacre on European soil perpetrated by this criminal regime to prove the pattern of huge waves of blood soaking the Middle East and even Europe since Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini grabbed the power in Tehran 41 years ago. And we didn't need another huge massacre in Villepinte to prove the regime atrocities, to prove its crimes against humanity, and even genocides like the 1988 massacre of 30,000 political prisoners, and the other thousands of victims in Iranian jails, political prisoners, opponents, tortured, murdered, executed, and even the killing of Iranian expatriates in Europe, like Ambassador Rajavi was mentioned by Madame Rajavi in the presentation, in the initial presentation. All the elements and the evidences collected by the Belgian prosecutors, thanks to an outstanding coordination, finally, a really outstanding coordination between French, Belgian, German, and Austrian security services, are leading up to a historical trial against the terrorists who attempted on the lives of almost 50,000 persons, and the ones of the NCRI leaders and Madame Maryam Rajavi in the 2018 bombing plot in Villepinte. Dozens of foreign delegations, and there was a large Italian delegation as well. Dozens of foreign delegations with hundreds of dignitaries were attending the gathering. That would have been targeted by the attack planned by the Iranian intelligence and by the now very notorious Iranian terrorist diplomat, Mr. Assadi. His identification of a ranking diplomat who was serving his country, quote unquote serving, because we know that it was a terrorist service, that he was serving his country in Vienna, is the architect of the plot, and that could sound as a case of deviant behavior of a bad egg, which is, among other positive elements, is really the black point and the bad guy in the Iranian diplomatic service. But that was not the case. Actually, he was a sort of normality, his presence as a terrorist in the diplomatic ranks of his country. And it confirms that Iran is the #1 terrorist state in the world, as I have already said. It is unprecedented, and that was already noted and underlined in the previous intervention. It is really unprecedented for a sovereign state, for a member of the United Nations, a signatory part of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. It is unprecedented to use its diplomatic apparatus, diplomatic immunities, and diplomatic officers in order to develop terrorist activities and to develop them so brazenly. The case on itself reveals volumes about the nature of the Iranian theocracy. We cannot wait any longer in increasing across the board in all possible sectors of diplomatic relations. We cannot wait any longer to implement a strategy of maximum pressure against this regime of assassins. Tehran must understand that it will pay the heaviest of the prices. The Iranian diplomats who do help the terrorists must be, all of them, indicted and prosecuted whenever the evidence of a terrorist plot exists, whenever it emerges. And they must be immediately expelled from our countries in case of threatening intelligence activities. And Iranian embassies, governmental offices and institutions, directly or indirectly involved in those operations, or connected with organizations such as MOIS, IRGC, Hezbollah. I was mentioning Hezbollah, the risk that we have that are posed by Hezbollah presence in Europe. All these offices, Iranian offices, must be promptly closed. A true European deterrence is needed, finally. European Union's resolution, for instance, to include senior Iranian intelligence personnel in the EU list of terrorists was important, yes, months ago, but was, no doubt, too little, too late. And the European Union still does not entirely see Iran as a fundamental threat against its citizens. And some of the opponents of the regime who were assassinated in the past or were on the assassination hit list were European citizens, and the European Union just didn't react properly. So to conclude, there is no doubt that after the latest revelation by Reuters that Assadi threatened the Belgian judiciary, and after that the EU did not react to these threats, now the European governments, the European Parliament, and all the friends and supporters that freedom and democracy have in the entire world should be very much louder more clear and speak up and act against these intimidation and intimidation that have been launched by a diplomat-terrorist and by the criminals who belong to a government which has dispatched those terrorists to the European soil to kill European people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your remarks and for the eloquent and informative remarks that you have just made. I fully agree that now it is time for holding the Iranian regime's leader accountable for all the crimes that they have committed, whether in acts of terrorism or, as you just mentioned, the massacre of 30,000 political prisoners back in 1988. Now, I would like to ask our next speaker, Senator Robert Torricelli, to take the floor and share his thought with us. Senator, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity. Let me first congratulate Mrs. Rajavi on her remarks, but more than that, on her incredible courage of remaining steadfast in the face of what was an attack upon potentially all of us, but in particular on her and her own life. I also want to praise the police work of the governments of Germany and Belgium and France and their judicial systems. It was, in the first instance, an incredibly impressive piece of intelligence and police work, but also the steadfastness of those governments in proceeding with this case in the face of what must be enormous international diplomatic pressure is impressive, and it should be noted by all of us. I do, however, having complimented each of these governments, would like to point out an extraordinary irony, perhaps to the annoyance of some of our guests and viewers. But it needs to be noted that while a trial is proceeding on a case in which diplomats accredited by host countries were engaged in potentially alleged terrorist activities, simultaneously, some of these same governments are arguing in international forum that arms sales should be allowed to Tehran. And diplomats show up for work every day all across Europe, representing the same government that used the same diplomatic channels, in some cases the same embassies, for a terrorist attack on European citizens. I'll state no conclusion about it. The facts speak for themselves, but it should at least be noted. I think we also all recognize, particularly those of us who have spent our lives in the law, that while all defendants are equal, all crimes are not. There is the crime against the individual, here an attempt that would have killed potentially hundreds of people. And then there are crimes against the society itself, its structure, the foundations, its principles by which it governs itself. That is this case. A bomb potentially in the heart of Paris that would have taken some of our very lives is one thing. But the choice of Paris, which to many of us is the symbol of liberty itself, in the nation perhaps most identified with the creation of republican forms of government, was not by chance. This was an attack not simply on us as individuals, but on European democracy, Western values, the things that we hold dear. And if, in fact, the response of the various European nations is simply to jail these individuals, well, that will serve justice, but it hardly rises to the challenge, hardly deals with the reality that it was an attack not on us, but on all European countries and your liberties. I am I am impressed that the case has gone this far and been so skillfully handled. But in fact, it is yet to be determined whether we fully meet the challenge. Because let's be frank, if you sit in Tehran today, well, they did not take our lives. They did not have the mass murder they contemplated. On balance, so far, the attack was a success. There was an element of intimidation, to be certain. They've paid no price, but a few operatives potentially being jailed. No one in the regime who ordered these attacks has been indicted. No consulates have been closed. No diplomats have been sent home. Let me contrast this for reference with how Albania handled this with a terrorist act on its soil. Diplomats were sent home. And while relations have continued, they clearly are different. Albania took note of what was going to happen on its soil. And while I would prefer that those relations have been broken, they are clearly in a state of different relations. Now, that is not to say the various European countries have not taken some actions. But if you're sitting in Tehran, you launched the attack, you had it was a statement, it was an act of intimidation, and what's the price? I am not discounting the actions of our lawyers that I admire greatly in bringing the case, bringing a civil case. I'm so grateful you're doing so, proud to be a plaintiff in it. But I hope that your courage, your skill, your actions are matched by your governments. I say only this with admiration for the governments involved. There are a few nations I admire more than France or Germany or Belgium. But the burden is now on all of us to, if we genuinely are going to send a message to Tehran, genuinely assure that no one else would be victim to this kind of state-sponsored terrorism. The burden is on all of us. We can have the trial, we can get verdicts, criminal and civil, but then what? Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, for your eloquent remarks. You're absolutely correct that the judicial proceedings is only one aspect of this case. But as you said, the real challenge is for the politicians, for the governments, and for the EU as a whole to stand up or live up with the challenge that they are facing. May I also remind that both Senator Torricelli and Ambassador Terzi, who just spoke, they are civil parties to the case. And our next speaker, Ambassador Robert Joseph, the former Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, is also a civil party to this case. Ambassador Joseph, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this important event. I've been asked on a number of occasions why I decided to join the case as a civil party. Part of my response is that I was in attendance at the rally, a peaceful, even joyous gathering, bringing together tens of thousands of participants who seek a democratic and free Iran, who seek basic respect for human rights, and who seek an end to the religious dictatorship that has committed mass murder of its own citizens, true crimes against humanity. Given that the intended target of the attack was Mrs. Rajavi, the leader of the Democratic opposition, I could well have been one of the victims as I was seated only a few yards from her. But I think beyond the personal dimension, and even more important than the personal dimension, I believe as a matter of principle, it is incumbent upon all of us, individuals and governments, to stand up against terrorism in any form, if we fail to stand up against the evil that is terrorism, if we seek to appease those who would commit such heinous crimes, we would only encourage more attacks, more crimes, and we would become complicit in that evil. The planned bombing, one that could have been the most massive terrorist attack in Europe to date, is not an isolated case or an action of rogue agents. As others have said, it is part of an orchestrated campaign directed at the highest levels of government in Tehran. Since its foundation, the regime has used terrorist acts directly and through proxies against its adversaries, foreign and domestic. This continues today. In Europe alone, in the past few years, Iranian agents have operated and planned lethal attacks across the continent. In Albania, in Austria, the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and I could go on. In the current case, the terrorist diplomat, and I pause every time I use those two words together. The terrorist diplomat was caught red-handed, arrested as he was giving a powerful explosive to his accomplices. As others have said, an explosive that could have caused large-scale damage. Far from expressing concern or remorse about the likely loss of hundreds of lives, the only response from the jailed agent, who has been masquerading as a diplomat assigned to Iran's embassy in Vienna, has been to threaten more deaths if he is convicted. Truly, this is an evil regime with no regard for how many innocent people it might murder. So what does this planned terrorist attack tell us about the regime? First, this is a cynical, desperate regime resorting to acts of mass murder of its domestic opposition, more recently killing thousands of protesters in the streets across Iran, aligning with the Assad regime against the people of Syria, committing armed attacks against its neighbors in the Gulf. All of these actions reveal the fundamental desperation of the regime. And the planned bombing in Paris is just one more act of desperation. Second, this is not a regime with whom we can do business, to borrow a Cold War phrase. The regime is not going to become more moderate or become a responsible stakeholder that respects the norms of a rule-based international order. And third, and perhaps most fundamental in terms of understanding the regime's desperation, this is a regime that has lost all legitimacy with its own people. In fact, the Iranian people are now the greatest threat to the regime. The recent Amnesty International report, which was punctuated by the tragic and despicable hanging of Navid Afkari, the champion wrestler who was falsely accused and coerced, demonstrates for the world to see the atrocities of the regime, its barbaric torture, and the flagrant murder of those who seek a free Iran. Hoping again and again for the leadership to become more moderate is sheer fantasy. This is a regime that survives only through brutal repression, and this will not change no matter how much we may hope for it to change. And finally, what policies conclusions should we draw? First, as a matter of both policy and principle, we must support democracy and human rights. Expressions of support from heads of state and government leaders for those inside Iran seeking democracy are vital, as they uphold the importance of human rights as a principle of the international order and add to the pressure on the regime. Second, we must support the democratic opposition inside and outside of Iran. We know that regime change must and will come from within. While the Iranian officials and their apologists consistently spin the line that the current regime is the only alternative to chaos in a failed state, the 10-point plan of the NCRI, calling for democracy, respect for human rights, a free and non-nuclear Iran, provides a pathway for the future and an insurance policy against a failed state outcome. Third, and perhaps most timely, we must not throw the regime a lifeline that will only prolong the regime's terrorism, its regional aggression, and the specter of a nuclear breakout. We must not return to the failed policies of appeasement, a path that is often characterized as a choice of diplomacy over war, but this was and remains a false choice. We know that negotiations did not lead to a more moderate Iran. In fact, the regime took the billions of dollars it gained from the JCPOA, and what wasn't siphoned off through corruption was used to fund foreign aggression, internal repression, and terrorist acts, such as we saw in the planned bombing in Paris. The central problem is not the absence of negotiations or the absence of a particular agreement. More agreements will only lead to more aggression and more brutality. The central problem is the regime itself. The parallels to the situation in Europe in the 1930s, at least to me, are striking. Let me stop there. Thank you again.
June 30th, 2018. Annual Iranian Resistance meeting at Villepin, north of Paris. Dozens of senior international dignitaries gathered to support the Iranian resistance movement led by NCRI President-elect Maryam Rajavi. Among them, Rudy Giuliani, Newt Gingrich, Bill Richardson, Bernard Kouchner, Stephen Harper, Ingrid Betancourt, Sid Ahmad Ghazali, and others. Nobody knew that the 100,000-strong gathering was in the crosshairs of the mullahs' terrorism machine for at least a year. On the same day, Belgian authorities foiled the terrorist plot by arresting a hit team in Brussels en route to Villepin with a powerful bomb in the trunk of their car to be placed among the gathering crowd. Another terrorist was arrested at the venue. Mrs. Rajavi was the primary target. The next day, a senior Iranian diplomat in Vienna, Assadollah Assadi, was arrested in Germany while returning to Austria from Luxembourg, where he had personally delivered the explosives to the terrorist agents. Assadi was the intelligence ministry station chief at the regime's Vienna embassy since 2014. Iran's Supreme National Security Council, headed by regime president Hassan Rouhani, decided to carry out this major terrorist operation following a green light from regime supreme leader Ali Khamenei. The plot came after the major nationwide anti-regime uprising in Iran in December 2017 and January 2018 that shook the regime to its foundations. In January 2018, Khamenei had underscored the role of the MEK and its network in leading the uprising. According to recent media reports, an investigation has concluded that the terrorist plot was not an individual initiative, but that of the Iranian regime and its Ministry of Intelligence and Security. Reuters reported on October 9, 2020, that according to a police document, Assadi, quote, warned authorities of possible retaliation by unidentified groups if he is found guilty, end of quote. According to segments of a March 12 meeting between Assadi and Belgian authorities obtained by Reuters, Assadi told the police that armed groups in Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, and Syria, as well as in Iran, were interested in the outcome of his case and would be, quote, watching from the sidelines to see if Belgium would support them or not, end of quote. It is time for the EU to end its silence on such an outrageous threat and hold the Iranian regime accountable for resorting to terrorism in Europe.
A short clip, but very informative, of the terrorist plot by the Iranian regime and its agents on June 30th, 2018 at the Free Iran rally. At this stage now, I would like to invite Mr. Claude Moniquet, the CEO of European Strategic Intelligence and Security, to share his thought with us. Mr. Moniquet, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hashemi. Everyone hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm dealing with intelligence and security matters for the last 40 years, and especially I'm dealing with Iranian terrorism and Iranian intelligence since '87. It was just after the attack, the Iranian attack attacks in Paris in 85 and 86, and the so-called Lebanon hostage crisis. So I think I'm a little bit familiar with the way Iran and Tehran are using terrorism as a political tool. William Bourdon said at the very beginning of this press conference that this will be an unprecedented trial, and it is very clear it will be, because it will be the first time we'll have an official Iranian, a diplomat, in the box on the trial. And this will underline something which is extremely important and which was not really understood in Europe and especially in Brussels and Paris for the last decades. Terror, when it comes to Iran, is not an accident. Terror is just a political tool the mullah regime could decide to use at one moment. When it is confronted to a threat or when it has to advocate its interest and its goals, the Iranian regime has a few possibilities. They could use normal diplomatic relations, they could use commercial relations, they could use, of course, intelligence, as other states do, but they could use also terror. And they will, and when they decide to do this, it is not decided just by one man somewhere in Tehran. It's the whole regime which decided, because everything is depending of the Supreme National Security Council, the SNSC, and inside the SNSC, you'll find all the representatives of all the most important centers of power in Iran. You will find, of course, a representative of the President of the Republic, of the Supreme Guide, but you will also find the Speaker of the Parliament. You will find the Chief Justice. You will find the Chief of General Staff, the Chief of the Army, the Revolutionary Guards, and so on. So it is very clear that all those people, there are 12 usually, all those people, when it comes to use terror as a political tool, are concerned because they are taking the decision to do so. There is clearly, it was said by the Iranian that the first defense was that everything was a Zionist or a Western plot, and this terror attack was a fake and was never a real terrorist attack. The second line of defense of the regime was to say that the Assadi, the most important defendant, was a rogue element, someone acting on his own. It must be very clear that something like a rogue element doesn't exist in the Iranian regime. When it comes to intelligence, when it comes to terror, when it comes to serious things and serious concern, there is no independence of people and there is no rogue elements able to decide on their own that they will conduct a terrorist operation in Paris or in London or in Vienna. I would like to add a few words to answer a question which was asked a few minutes ago. What can we wait if Assadi is convinced? Very clearly, and all the story of Iran since the last 4 decades goes in the same direction. Very clearly, we can wait a terrorist or several terrorist operations, not only against the Belgian interest, but probably against the European interest, maybe against France, maybe against Germany, and so on. We know, for instance, that the regime tried to exert a considerable, and it didn't try, actually it's exerted a considerable pressure on the French government to push the French government to ask the Belgian authorities not to prosecute Assadi. So as France failed in what was requested by the regime, France could be a target for the Iranian terrorism, and not only on the French soil, but also, of course, in the Middle East, in Africa, or in South America. This is the nature of the regime. And most of all, it is also a pure product of our weakness. I mean the European weakness. For since the 1980s and the 1990s, the mullah regime conducted several numerous terrorist operations against European interests, both in Europe, in Vienna, in Paris, in Berlin, in other places, and in other parts of the world. So clearly, there was no real answer to the European answer, I mean firm European answer to those terrorist threats and those terrorist actions. And Tehran understood that it was possible to threaten and even to attack Europe without having any price to pay. All the opposite. Those attacks benefited to Iran, which got exactly each time what it was looking for. So I think clearly that the only question today is what European Union should do and what European Union will do after the trial if Assadi is convinced, which is meaning that behind Assadi, of course, it will be all the regime and all the government which will be taken, must be taken accountable for this terrorist action. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Monique, for your remarks. At this point, I'm informed that we have been joined by Mr. Mohammad Mohaddessin, chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. Mr. Mohaddessin represents the NCRI as civil party in the current proceedings in Belgium. He is a former political prisoner under the Shah's regime, and for the past 35-40 years, he has been leading the international activities of the Iranian Resistance. Mr. Mohaddessin, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hashemi. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for dear friends who raised all the points which it was necessary. I think what happened in 2018, or supposed to happen, it was an indication about the nature and the policy of this regime. As I mentioned just now, I myself, as a witness, I have testified for several hours, 7-8 hours, and I went through all the details which showed very clearly that the leadership of the regime, the supreme leader, the president, foreign minister, intelligence minister, all the high-ranking officials of the regime were participating in this plot. All of them were participating in this plot, and it was a decision by the whole government, whole regime, whole system. And the main reason, according to the documents which we submitted to the judiciary system in Belgium, according to the documents, the main reason of this plot was the situation of the regime. You know, everyone is aware that in January 2018, in December 2017, January 2018, we had a very extensive uprising, very angry about this uprising. And after the uprising, Khamenei and the other officials of the regime pinpointed on the MEK PMI as the main source of this uprising. And they promised that they will revenge, they will act against PMI, MEK because of this uprising. First, they started to plot in Albania to have a very big explosive operation inside Albania within the People's Mujahideen Organization facilities, while it was the ceremony of New Iranian Year, the moment which Maryam Rajavi had presented that meeting and some other foreign guests in this meeting. When this plot defeated by the authorities in Albania, Iranian regime started the plan B. They had a plan A was in Albania, the plan B in Villepin, Paris, and you know everything about that. This plot, the main target in this plot, of course, was Mrs. Rajavi. You know, many of our friends had presence in this gathering, and Iranian regime was targeting Mrs. Rajavi because this regime is thinking as its strategy to confront Iranian uprising is to neutralize the opposition, the organized opposition movement. I mean NCRI, PMI, National Council of Resistance Iran, and People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran. Many points which already has mentioned by our dear friends, speakers, other speakers, but I should emphasize once again on this point that the plan which Iranian regime had in Villepin, it is no matter of discussion that it was a plan for a very extensive crime against humanity. It was not an ordinary terrorist operation. It was not an ordinary operation which Iranian regime had many times in various countries. They were trying to have to create a mass killing, which there is no matter of discussion that it was, if it happened, it was crime against humanity. So in this moment, it's very important the reaction of Western countries, especially European Union. Why I appreciate the activities of security services in Belgium and other countries who which neutralized this ominous operation. I must reiterate that on this point that political decision maker in EU should have an appropriate reaction towards this very big crime. This is, I can say, this is an historical test or challenge for EU, whether they want to stand on their human rights, democratic standards, or they want to continue to deal with a terrorist dictatorship ruling Iran. There is no matter of discussion that this regime is going to fall. This regime has no chance to continue for a long time. So this is the time for all European countries, EU and other Western countries to decide to be firm against this regime. As Mrs. Rajavi emphasized this afternoon, we call on closing the embassies of the regime, which just now it is absolutely clear that these embassies are center of terrorism and spying against not only Iranian opposition and Iranian dissidents, but spying against Western countries themselves. Second, to expel all agents of the regime, intelligence agents and terrorists who are affiliating with the regime from these countries. These are the measures which are necessary for the safety and security of not only Iranian people and the Iranian refugees, Iranian opponents, but necessary for the safety and security of the EU citizens, the people who are living here. Thank you very much, and I hope that European countries, as their representatives, as we heard 2 weeks ago from European Parliament, as they demanded from their government, they will have a very strong reaction against Iranian regime and its terrorist attitude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mohaddissin. Let me now introduce our next speaker, Mr. Struan Stevenson, a former member of the European Parliament who has been pursuing the political situation in Iran for the past 20 years. Mr. Stevenson, you have the floor, please.
Struan Stevenson. I was present at the gathering in Villepinte in July 2018, and I'm speaking as a plaintiff in the trial of Assadollah Assadi, the Iranian diplomat from their embassy in Vienna. Throughout history, diplomats as the representatives of sovereign states have enjoyed a distinct status. Under the terms of the Vienna Convention, diplomats enjoy special privileges. Assadi violated each of the core principles of diplomacy in a way that has sent shockwaves across the civilized world. He is a known undercover agent for the Iranian intelligence service and clearly was the key operative in this attempt to cause death and destruction at the large gathering of supporters of the Iranian opposition near Paris. Thanks to a combined operation by the German, French and Belgian intelligence services, all 4 conspirators were arrested in June 2018 and are on trial on charges of terrorism and conspiracy to commit murder. Had the bomb plot succeeded, dozens, if not hundreds, of innocent people, perhaps including myself, would have been killed or seriously injured. What is also abundantly clear is that Assadi must have been acting under orders. A bomb attack of this magnitude could only have been validated by the Iranian regime's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and by its president, Hassan Rouhani. The foreign minister in charge of all diplomatic staff is Mohammad Javad Zarif. He must have been a key party to the terrorist plot, along with the Minister of Intelligence and Security, Mahmoud Alavi, and the leaders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the IRGC, and their extraterritorial terrorist offshoot, the Quds Force. The terrorists who were prepared to carry out this murderous atrocity must face European justice. But this trial must also establish the patrons of the crime, who clearly occupy the most senior positions in the government of Iran. They should be indicted and held to account for commanding and abetting this act of wanton terror. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. Our next speaker is another civil party to the case, Mr. Taher Boumedra. Mr. Boumedra, please, you have the floor.
I am Taher Boumedra. I'm the former chief of United Human Rights Office in Iraq and former special advisor of the SRG on issues related to Camp Ashraf, where some 3,400 members of the MEK lived as protected persons under the 4th Geneva Convention. I solemnly testify of the following. During my mission in Iraq and in Camp Ashraf, I have monitored the situation of the MEK members being subjected to all forms of persecution and to numerous armed attacks on orders by the Iranian authorities coordinated from the Iranian embassy in Baghdad. Aware of the responsibility of the Iranian authorities of these attacks, I, together with the SRG, namely first at Melkert and then Martin Kobler, I used to meet periodically with the Iranian ambassador in Baghdad to plead with him to stop the attacks against Camp Ashraf, and to no avail. Camp Ashraf was eventually closed, and its residents moved to Camp Liberty near Baghdad airport after an ultimatum was given by the Iranian ambassador in Baghdad and the then Prime Minister of Iraq, Nouri al-Maliki, to the effect that Camp Ashraf be closed or its residents would face the consequences. It is public knowledge that even after closing Camp Ashraf and the transfer of its residents to Camp Liberty, they were subject of deadly attacks on different occasions. Based on my experience I gained on the ground, dealing with different interlocutors, namely the office of the Iraqi Prime Minister, the Iranian embassy in Baghdad, the diplomatic community in Baghdad, the Iraqi civil society, and the residents of Camp Ashraf, I came to the conclusion that the Iranian authorities consider the MEK as the main serious threat to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Hence, the need to exterminate all members of the MEK who refuse to disband and repent. My conviction is also based on extended research I have undertaken on the Iranian constitution and its bylaws. Two basic tenets characterize the Iranian regime. First, the protection of the Islamic Republic's regime by the establishment of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Corps Guard, that is given all the authority to that effect. The second is the export of the Islamic Revolution with the aim of establishing a universal Islamic Republic. It is mandatory to use all means to achieve these constitutional goals, including the eradication of all opposition. We have seen what the Iranian regime has done in the summer of 1988. More than 30,000 political prisoners were extrajudicially executed. It is also in this context that the Islamic Republic of Iran is striving to achieve the nuclear bomb. The reported terrorist threat made by Assadollah Assadi, currently in detention in Belgium, suspected of organizing a terrorist attack against the annual gathering of the MEK on 30th of June 2018 in Villepinte, in France, stems from the Islamic Republic's ideology embodied in its constitution. This is not an individual act of some agents of the MOIS, the Ministry of Interior and Security. They are policy decisions taken by the highest level of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you, Mr. Boumetra. And now, before we finish, we go to our last speaker, Mr. Abolghasem Rezai, a senior member of the National Council of Resistance of Iran and a former political prisoner under the Shah. Mr. Rezai, please, you have the floor.
Hello to all of our friends who are in this conference.
منم به عنوان یکی از کسایی که تو این پرونده جزء شهود بودم خواستم چند نکته رو به طور خلاصه بگم. البته همه حرفای ضروری و نکات رو همه دوستان و وکلای ما گفتن. همونطور که وکیل شورای ملی مقاومت گفت این مهمترین پرونده تروریستی قرن 21.
As one of the lawyers of the NCRI said, this is one of the most important cases of the recent years.
البته واضحه که چون این رژیم در حال سرنگونیه نیاز به جنایاتی از این دست داره.
And it's clear that because this regime is in the verge of overthrow, they need such actions and terrorist activities.
ابتدا هم می‌خواستن این عمل تروریستی رو در آلبانی انجام بدن که شکست خورد.
In the beginning, they attempted to pursue a terrorist attack in Albania, which was defeated.
و بعد در ویلپند اقدام به این عمل جنایتکارانه کردن.
And then they took these terrorist actions in Villepinte in France.
آقای ترتسی که در این کنفرانس بودند اشاره کردند که شیطان سازی و تروریسم دو روی یک سکه هستند.
Mr. Tertsi in his speech emphasized that demonization campaign and terrorism are two sides of a coin of the Iranian regime.
میخواستم بگم اتفاقا در این کیس هم وزارت اطلاعات این دو اقدام رو همزمان میخواست انجام بده.
I also wanted to emphasize that in this case the Iran's Ministry of Intelligence wanted to pursue the both actions at the same time.
یعنی همون زمانی که در حال انجام این عمل تروریستی بود،
meaning that at the same time they were pursuing this terrorist act,
دو تن از مزدوران و نفوذی‌های شناخته شدهش به نام ایرج مصداقی و مسعود خدابنده در حال مصاحبه و کمپین دروغ علیه مجاهدین بودند. آقای جانسانا گفتند که رژیم با شیطان سازی میخواد جنایات خودش رو به گردن مقاومت و اپوزیسیون بندازه.
blame the opposition on their own regarding their own crimes.
در این پرونده ویلپند هم تلاش کرد که مدعی بشه که این نفرات وابسته به مجاهدین هستند.
In this case of Villepinte terrorist act also they try to blame the opposition regarding this terrorist activity.
اما این توطئه خنثی شد چون اسناد متقنی مثل
And again this plot and a lot of documents and pictures that were in the hands of the police that show that the regime was behind this plot. I only wanted to emphasize, like most of the speakers, that despite the fact that there is a clear terrorist fight in this case, I'd like to emphasize that the European countries should not end this case by just putting few people in the court and sentencing just few people. But this is a state-sponsored terrorism. The Iranian regime must be taken accountable.
این اساس باید رابطه‌شون رو با رژیم تنظیم کنن
define their relationship with the Iranian regime based on this act
و نه بر اساس سیاست استعمارات.
and not based on the appeasement policy.
با تشکر از هم.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rezai. So now we have come to the end of our conference. If I may very briefly summarize, I think we all agreed that this is a unique case, the current proceedings in Belgium, as it was called by Mr. Bowden a historical trial. It was also, everybody agreed that this is a case done not just by a few rogue elements, but the Iranian regime, the entirety of the Iranian regime was behind this. It was decided at the highest level at the Supreme Security Council with the presence of the regime's president, Hassan Rouhani, and Javad Zarif, his foreign minister, and then approved by Khamenei before it was implemented. It was also said that this attack clearly shows the nature of the Iranian regime, of the mullahs regime, and at the same time, its fear of the main resistance movement, the opposition, the People's Mujahideen Organization, and the NCRI as an alternative to the theocratic regime. Furthermore, while this heinous crime was an act against humanity, the prime target was Mrs. Rajavi, the president-elect of the NCRI, but obviously the casualties would have been devastating because of the nature of the bomb that they were using. So now the question that will remain is whether the European Union, the member states of the EU, will face the challenge of changing their policy of appeasement, changing the policy of the conciliatory policy of the past, and to really take appropriate actions as it was referred to, such as closing the embassy or expelling the intelligence agents of the Iranian regime who have been for many years operating in Europe, preparing for such heinous crime. So having said that, I would like to also thank all the dignitaries, Ambassador Joseph, Ambassador Terzi, Senator Torricelli, and our distinguished lawyer, Mr. Van Russell, and others for joining us for this conference. Thank you very much all for being with us today.
Thank you.